The first time Abby saw the ghost, she didn't believe it was real. It was 3 years ago, on the night William died, when she thought she glimpsed his face in the crowd outside the restaurant. She'd chased after the figure, calling his name, but it vanished into the night like smoke. When the police called hours later to tell her William had been killed in a car accident, she convinced herself it had been her imagination, a trick of grief and desperation. But now, as she sat alone at their usual table, the memory of that night haunted her. What if it hadn't been her mind playing tricks? What if William had been trying to say goodbye? Abby traced the rim of her wine glass, her gaze fixed on the empty chair across from her. The restaurant was alive with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, but she felt like an outsider looking in. 3 years had passed since William's death, yet the pain was as raw as ever. She glanced at the door, half expecting him to walk in, his signature grin lighting up the room. But deep down, she knew he never would. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a text from her best friend, Amaka. "Thinking of you today. Call me if you need anything." Abby sighed and put her phone away. Amaka had been her rock these past few years, but even she couldn't understand the depth of Abby's grief. As the evening wore on, Abby's hope began to wane. She was about to leave when a man approached her table. The man was tall and impeccably dressed, his smile warm but tinged with something Abby couldn't quite place. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and calming. "Is this seat taken?" Abby hesitated, surprised by his boldness. She glanced around the restaurant, noting the empty tables, but something about him made her nod. "It's all yours," she replied. As they talked, Abby found herself drawn to his easy charm and sharp wit. He introduced himself as Alex, and though she was initially guarded, his presence felt oddly comforting. Yet there were moments when something seemed off. He never ordered food or drink, and his answers to personal questions were vague. When he mentioned her favorite book, one she'd never told anyone about, a chill ran down her spine. Who is this man, and how did he know so much about me? By the end of the evening, Abby's unease had grown. Alex had been kind and engaging, but his behavior was undeniably strange. As they parted ways, he handed her a small, folded note. "Read this when you get home," he said with a cryptic smile. Abby nodded. Her curiosity piqued, but the weight of the note in her hand felt heavier than it should. When she returned home, she unfolded the note. It read, "The past is a shadow, but the future is yours to shape." The words sent a shiver through her. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just a coincidence, but sleep eluded her that night. Her dreams were filled with fragmented images of William and Alex, their faces blending together in a way that left her unsettled. The next morning, Abby visited William's grave. As she did every year on the anniversary of his death, she knelt before the headstone, her fingers brushing the engraved letters of his name. "I miss you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. As she stood to leave, something caught her eye, a gravestone just a few feet away. The name on it made her blood run cold. Alex Adeyemi. Her heart raced as she stared at the photo on the gravestone. It was him, the man she'd spoken with last night. But how? She stumbled back, her mind reeling. Was it a coincidence, a cruel joke, or something far more inexplicable? Determined to find answers, she snapped a photo of the gravestone and hurried away. Abby spent the rest of the day researching Alex Adeyemi. She discovered he had died 5 years ago in a car accident, leaving behind a widow named Helen. The details of his life were sparse, but one thing was clear. The man she'd met couldn't possibly be alive, yet the memory of his warm smile and the note he'd given her felt undeniably real. She decided to visit Helen, posing as an old friend of Alex. When she arrived at Helen's home, she was greeted by a warm, middle-aged woman with kind eyes. Helen invited her in, and as they talked, Abby felt a strange connection to her. Helen spoke fondly of Alex, her voice tinged with both love and sorrow. "He was my everything," she said. "But life goes on, doesn't it?" Helen's story was one of resilience. After Alex's death, she had struggled to rebuild her life. She'd remarried and started a family, but she still cherished the memories of her time with Alex. "He would have wanted me to be happy," she said, her voice steady. "And I know he's at peace, watching over me." Abby listened intently, her heart aching with a mix of emotions. She wanted to tell Helen about her encounter with Alex, but she held back, unsure of how to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. Instead, she asked Helen how she'd found the strength to move on. Helen smiled softly. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but I realized that holding on to the past was keeping me from living. Alex will always be a part of me, but I had to let go to find happiness again." That night, Abby dreamed of Alex. He stood in the restaurant, his expression somber. "Thank you for talking to Helen," he said, "but there's something I need you to tell her." He handed her a folded piece of paper, just like the one he'd given her in real life. When she woke, the paper was on her nightstand, its edges glowing faintly in the moonlight. The note read, "Tell her I'm proud of her. Tell her I love her, and I always will." Abby's hands trembled as she held the note. She didn't know how it had appeared, but she knew she had to deliver the message. The next morning, she returned to Helen's house, her heart pounding with anticipation. Helen was surprised to see Abby again, but welcomed her warmly. Abby hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "I have something to tell you," she said finally. "It's about Alex." She handed Helen the note, watching as her eyes filled with tears. Helen read the message, her hands shaking. "How did you—" she began, but Abby shook her head. "I don't know how to explain it," Abby admitted, "but I think he wanted you to know." Helen hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more to me than you can imagine." That evening, Abby returned to the restaurant, hoping to see Alex again. As she sat at her usual table, he appeared, his form shimmering faintly. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've given me the peace I needed to move on." Abby felt a lump in her throat. "What about me?" she asked. "How do I move on?" Alex smiled gently. "You already are," he said. "Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the love with you as you move forward." Before she could respond, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the air. As he disappeared, a warm breeze brushed past her, carrying with it a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Abby woke feeling lighter than she had in years. She visited William's grave one last time, her heart filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. "I'll always love you," she whispered, "but I'm ready to live again." As she walked away, she felt a gentle warmth on her skin, as if William were smiling down on her. That evening, she called Amaka. "Let's go out," she said. "I think it's time." Amaka's voice was filled with relief and joy. "I'll be there in an hour," she promised. As Abby hung up, she felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, the future felt full of possibilities. Abby and Amaka spent the evening laughing and reminiscing, their bond stronger than ever. As the night wore on, Abby realized how much she'd missed living. She made a promise to herself. She would no longer let grief define her. She would honor William's memory by embracing life and finding joy in the present. Over the next few weeks, Abby began to rediscover herself. She took up painting again, a hobby she'd abandoned after William's death. She reconnected with old friends and even started dating casually, though she wasn't ready for anything serious. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. One afternoon, while browsing an art gallery, Abby bumped into a man who seemed vaguely familiar. He introduced himself as Daniel, a photographer who had recently moved to the city. They struck up a conversation, and Abby found herself drawn to his passion and kindness. As they talked, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Daniel asked her out for coffee, and though she hesitated, she agreed. As they sat in a cozy cafe, Abby realized how much she'd missed this, the simple joy of getting to know someone new. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with love and happiness. As her relationship with Daniel grew, Abby found herself thinking less about William and more about the present. She still visited his grave occasionally, but the visits were no longer filled with pain. Instead, they were a chance to reflect on the love they'd shared and the lessons it had taught her. One evening, as she sat with Daniel, watching the sunset, she realized she was finally ready to let go. She would always carry William's memory in her heart, but she was no longer bound by it. She was free to love again, and that was a gift she would never take for granted. The following Valentine's Day, Abby did something she hadn't done in years. She celebrated. She and Daniel spent the day exploring the city, laughing and creating new memories. As they sat together that evening, Abby felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. She thought of William and Alex, their love stories intertwined with her own. She knew they would always be a part of her, but she was no longer defined by their absence. She had found a way to honor their memory while embracing the present. As the years passed, Abby built a life filled with love and joy. She and Daniel married, and together they created a family. She never forgot William or the lessons he'd taught her about love and loss. But she also knew that life was meant to be lived, not mourned. On every Valentine's Day, she would light a candle in memory of William and Alex, a quiet tribute to the love that had shaped her. And as she watched her children play, she knew she had found the happiness she'd once thought was lost forever. Love, she realized, is not a chain. It is a gift, one that could be shared and cherished in countless ways. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Stay tuned for more twists and drama.